I mean, they do reference Society of the Spectacle towards the end.
Yeah. Which was, I read that one around Christmas. Honestly, didn't retain a whole lot.
Yeah, isn't it like a bit of a flimsy text?
There's not very much to it. Yeah, it's... And also Guy Debord said it was the most important book of the 20th century, and he wrote it.
Sick. Footnotes to Endnotes.
Welcome to Footnotes to Endnotes.
My name is Uriah. I'm joined by my co-host, Mr.
Owen.
Good. We've gotten so good at this that we're now finishing each other's sentences.
Wow, amazing.
4 episodes in, and that's all it takes. That's all it takes, folks.
Yeah, this is a real like class consciousness emerging.
Yeah, class consciousness. I mean, this is like class. So what we've got here is episode 3 of our limited series podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
It's on notes podcast on the new housing question. You know, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I was actually able to find out who the author of this quote-unquote anonymous essay is.
Oh, shit. Are you doxing the author of Notes on the New Housing Question?
They self-doxed.
Okay, that's all right then.
A lot of these essays have been collected in like various anthologies and whatnot, and in those anthologies, the authors have been actually titled. I can't actually remember her name, but it's something. It's like Maya or something. I don't know.
Yeah, something like that.
Wait, did you
Well,
find
you mentioned it.
I did.
Well, we recorded this podcast today, obviously.
Right.
We totally didn't record it like over a week ago, but
I just.
Yeah, you
forgot.
mentioned while we were recording.
Well, isn't that interesting? I guess can't really talk about that. So, I mean, it's an all right episode.
Yeah, it's got some things in it. It's got some stuff. Leave a comment below if you are a homeowner.
Right. If you're a homeowner and you bought your home, if you're in the Veterans Association and
if you were alive in the 50s and can weigh in,
leave a comment, please. If you're alive in the 50s, leave a comment.
We were like
if you're a homeowner, leave a comment. If you're a millennial homeowner, oh my God, somebody's
please tell us like what black magic you engaged in to
be
able to be a millennial homeowner.
Please do. If you're a veteran, you should actually get off of our feed because we don't support the troops.
Yeah.
At least I don't. Oh, and do you support the troops?
I empathize with some of them on an individual level, but like as a class, like I can't say that I do.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, my name is Uriah. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at The Inverted Form. Owen, where can people find you on the internet?
On my website, world3.tk, and that's the number 3, not spelled out. And if you like the little tunes at the start of these podcasts, I make all of those, and you can find them on the internet.
Cool.
On my website.
All right, enjoy. So we are here reading the third essay in Endnotes number 2, Notes on the New Housing Question. Owen, do you want to give like a quick summary of the main theme and what it's about?
Yeah, well, reading the title and knowing that this collection of essays was written shortly after the housing crisis of the 2000s, I assumed that it was going to relate to the housing crisis. But really, they just use that as a jumping off point to discuss the concept of home ownership in America over the course of the 20th century, and how, owing to a few developments, namely the New Deal and the GI Bill following World War II, the concept of home ownership shifted and was actually instrumental in giving rise to the American middle class. How, with the shifting concept of home ownership, this allowed capitalism to further entrench itself into aspects of people's lives that were not previously considered part of the capitalist system, as you had the movement to a debt-based society in which more and more every aspect of every person's life was commodified and turned into a product on the market. I found this article interesting in part because it really deconstructs a lot of notions about the 1950s, 60s, 70s, etc. being this golden age of capitalism. It sort of shows how it wasn't really, like, a lot of it was just based around driving up debt and encouraging people to buy more, consume more. And beyond that, I think on a more abstract level, it really shows how a lot of the so-called individual experience of an individual living in a large society is actually framed and directed by the state and large-scale economic movements of the state. How much of what a person desires, much of their projects in life, what they seek out, how they feel about certain things, what they consider right and wrong behavior, how they feel about different sorts of social relations in the world, is framed heavily by the economic situation and the social situation they find themselves placed into. And I think this is like, it can become really obvious when you would examine a past era like the 1950s, but I think it's important to consider this in terms of the present day and how even now much of our so-called individual experience is merely we as individuals acting out predefined roles dictated by the state and the movements of capital.
Right. So yeah, totally. The main theme of this essay is like the integration of the reproduction aspects of existence, which is like the part of your life where you're not at work. So the main theme of this essay is about how that part of your life became commodified over the course of, this golden age of capitalism, really taking off in the 1950s, beginning, as they argue, in the 30s with like the New Deal and some of the state policies of Roosevelt that led up to that. But I think that theme is like especially relevant today, considering like the advancements of neoliberal capitalism and like the absolute permeation of every aspect of our life by like the value form and commodity, like to an extent that like people in the 50s really would not have been able to imagine. I think, like, especially with the development of technology and the internet, like just so much of how we conceive of ourselves and our projects and like just everything that we're trying to do with our life is like driven by at some level like a motivation to generate profit. It's like kind of like the curse of the millennial generation, I guess. But I mean, like this idea of the housing question and like how that all began around the house, how the reproduction of everyday life was integrated into capitalism with the house and household commodities is really just like the tip of the iceberg as far as commodification of one's life goes. This essay, it's pretty short. It's shorter than I think any of the other ones, and it's called Notes on the New Housing Question, and it is pretty. It's not so much like developing a sustained argument as it is like just like laying out some historical phenomena and like trying to draw a relation between them and like trying to just really nail down how the reproductive sphere of life became integrated into the marketplace, and how like the home and the housing question is really central to that in history. All right, so the first, do you have a quote from this first section that you think?
Yeah, I do have a highlighted section from the very first paragraph. All crises are crises of capital accumulation, and thereby of the reproduction of the life of the worker. However, because the life of the worker and her reproduction have been increasingly permeated by capital, this crisis has also moved deeper to become a crisis of the class relation itself. The development of this deeper crisis will be the story of the 21st century.
I mean, that has been foreshadowed so heavily by everything that we read so far.
Yeah.
Like, they're really focusing on the crisis of the class relation, and how, how that relates to what we saw in Misery and Debt, the idea of expanded reproduction, and, the possibility of jobs and the economy in the future just further diminishing, how the surplus population is just continually expanding.
Which I think seems to be one of the points raised in this article for me, was that it demonstrates how over the course of the 20th century, more and more of the individual's life was permeated by capital, to the point where now in the 21st century, it feels like our entire lives have been commodified. You can have any identity you want so long as it's a product that's sold on the market, or something that you will sell on the market as a product. And this is problematic on an ethical level, but it becomes even more problematic with the notion of the growing surplus population that they laid out in the previous articles, because your entire life becomes one of commodification, and yet you are increasingly pushed out of that process of being able to commodify. So it's like they took away everything that existed before the market, replaced it with marketed versions of those things, and then made it so that you wouldn't even be able to participate in the market more and more so.
Right. So I think the first historical phenomenon that they identify is the Great Depression of the 20th century, not the Great Recession of the 21st century, that this essay, this whole book came just 2 years after, but we're talking about the Great Depression. A speculative bubble in housing and consumer credit ballooned and then burst, sending shock waves throughout the U.S. banking system. While both forms of credit already played a significant role in U.S. prosperity and profitability, the 30s marked a dramatic shift in credit and mortgage markets. The United States was already by this time a rising economic powerhouse whose productivity, especially in agriculture, was leading to rising real wages and standards of living among the working class, while the introduction of the assembly line and other industrial innovations offered the potential for previously luxury commodities to enter into workers' consumption. So this I think this is like kind of the main historical speed bump that the antagonists that we're dealing with here, the capitalists, the New Dealers, had to deal with in their time, which was the issue of they have rising productivity and standards of living in the United States, but they're having the onset, especially with the Fordist system of manufacturing. They had this onset of mass productivity, but the problem was how to integrate, especially following the Great Depression, the working class into the market and have a mass consumption that could match the mass production and actually generate surplus profits for the capitalists. And they solved this problem with the New Deal. What do you know about the New Deal, Owen?
What do I know about the New Deal? Okay, I'm having flashbacks to high school history class here. What I've gleaned about the New Deal from this argument was that it allowed for a number of economic shifts to happen in America. It was the end of the gold standard, which, in my understanding, made it suddenly much easier to create money, for banks to give out loans. And essentially, in the short term, this allowed for all sorts of economic growth in the private sector, because it was the official shifting to a debt-driven economy where you could generate capital, which would allow more businesses and individuals to take out loans and to start business projects and to generally bring more activity into the market, which in the short term seemed like a very positive thing. It seemed like a way to generate energetic movement in society, but it was entirely based on debt.
Right, so they say here that it was after 1935 when the Banking Act created essential preconditions for post-war growth by revolutionizing the state's ability to manage the money supply and subsidize credit markets. Most importantly, it was during these years that the state began to regulate and provide capital for private banks and the savings and loan industry, transformed the Federal Reserve into a federal regulatory body, and assumed control of interest rates. By 1935, it had abolished the gold standard, was ensuring a host of private lenders against loss, and had expanded its ability to buy and sell Treasury securities as a means to supplement private bank reserves, while greatly expanding its powers to provide emergency loans to institutional lenders. Anyway, so I guess the idea of the New Deal that they're getting at here, that's really important for them, especially considering the question of the housing, the new housing question, is like allowing the state to intervene more directly into the market, which I guess is like essential to Keynesian economics. But like by eradicating the gold standard and by like allowing the state to, regulate banks and like get involved in the credit market, they're able to, like extend credit for individual consumers, which would in turn allow for them to participate more in the housing market, which later on they'll argue that the housing market is really the linchpin, the main driver of the American economy throughout the entire 20th century, and even now, after all of these fucking booms and busts in the housing market, after however many collapses of that market, it is still on the rise. There's still more people than ever today who own houses. Anyway, I guess we also have to talk about the context of the war, which is really important to this discussion, and they'll get into it a lot. They argue that the GI Bill, especially, is really integral to the housing market that is taking shape at this period. So this is all happening in the general war period, but moving into the post-war period, we're talking mid-40s. You have American troops returning home, and they have the GI Bill, was one of the main conveyors of these benefits, offering veterans up to 2 years vocational or college education, 1 year's unemployment pay, and, importantly, loans to start businesses or buy homes. In practice, the bill was notoriously racist, denying black vets access to their promised provisions. Yet the millions of white vets who did gain access to home loans were confronted with a homeland in short supply of available housing for themselves and their families. Rather than responding to this situation through the production of social housing as in Europe, the U.S. state chose instead to subsidize private provision for this basic need. Swiftly, massive construction and infrastructural projects were undertaken, providing a supply of houses to the returning population. Rates of homeownerships have since grown steeply and steadily, save a few blips during financial crises. So, you have the US states like setting itself up to be involved in their own economy and the banks and individual credit as well as banking credit to an extent, I mean, it's not too far into the history of capitalism, but to an extent never before seen. And, that has been dialed back so much in the contemporary age with free market capitalism just being given free reign. But at this stage in history, you have the state really intervening in the market. And then after the war in 1945, all these troops returning home, they are promised by the GI Bill all these benefits. But where is the money coming from? It's coming from credit.
Mm-hmm.
It's invented money.
Debt-driven money. And I can see, I'm putting myself in the headspace of someone at this era. You've just had the Great Depression, you've had the war, and now you have this seemingly magical ability to create all of this work in the marketplace. You have this large population that's suddenly encouraged to take out loans, to get mortgages, to buy homes, and also you need to build a lot of homes, so you're creating all of this work, you're creating all of this movement, all of this purchasing of commodities. I could see why that would be very seductive at the time, following a few pretty difficult decades.
Yeah.
This probably just seemed like a magical way to jumpstart the economy, and I mean, in fact, it did. Briefly, for a time. It's sort of like throwing the brick up in the air and praying that it just never comes back down.
It's very, very good metaphor. Just hoping that it doesn't come down and smash you in the head.
Yeah.
So yeah, all these soldiers returned home, but there were not enough houses for them. It's interesting here that they contrast with what happened in Europe, where they, I guess, created social housing, but the United States and its absolute fetishization of the free market decides to leave it up to the free market, and all this construction and infrastructure gets undertaken, and it happens really quickly. When you have entire populations who are just doing nothing but work on building houses and infrastructure, that shit can happen pretty quickly. And then, I guess at this point we should introduce two of the principal antagonists in this story, which are the Federal Housing Association, the FHA, which is a mortgage insurance program established by the National Housing Act in 1934, and the Veterans Administration, the VA, which is a mortgage guarantee program established in 1944. This is a quote, "By ensuring private lenders against loss and popularizing the use of long-term amortizing mortgages, the FHA and VA revived and dramatically expanded the markets for home improvement and for privately owned homes, eventually making these markets the bedrock of the new consumer economy." So later on in the essay, they're going to get into the explicit racist policies of the FHA, and they're also going to get into just how important this Federal Housing Association was to the American economy at this point. And the VA as well also held, all of the policies that we're talking about in terms of integrating the working class into the housing and credit markets are, they're really geared towards white people, white workers, whereas non-white workers are excluded systematically, and at some point they cite some explicitly racist policies on the part of these organizations that excluded non-white workers from participating in this new economy.
And I feel like here is where you really start to see the creation of this phenomenon called the American middle class, where these white war vets returning home are now suddenly moving to these new styles of houses in these essentially new creations called suburbs, which are far away from where people of color and other people who've remained as the working class are living. So already there's this sort of psychological onset of a sense of distinction. Oh, you're part of the middle class. You live in a suburb with other people who look like you, act like you, have houses like you, drive to work like you. Whereas the working class, no, they're different. They're people from other places who look different than us. They live in slums in the city. They can't afford the nice things that we can afford. I don't know why. Maybe it's because they're doing something wrong. Maybe they're just not as good at capitalism as we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, it's, state policies at the highest levels of power that are systematically excluding like entire sections of the population from participating in the economy. And I think that gets to like a kind of an important part of the theme of this essay, which is like the commodification of everyday life, and like the creation of this concept of the middle class is really, I mean, it seems pretty like integral to all of that. Like,
Yeah.
like you need like, in order to sell luxury items to the middle class and to like sell the idea of a middle class to the middle class, then you need to like distinguish them or against something lower than them. So like, in order to have a middle class, you need a lower class.
Yeah. And the idea of buying products becomes like this status symbol where you've bought this large house, which is specifically designed to be filled up with stuff you buy. And even like the form of the suburb is kind of like this, it's almost like a 20th century simulacra of a peasant village where nobody's actually farming, nobody's actually producing any of their own survival needs. It's just this nice place where you and other white people store all the stuff you're buying.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, it's like it's a form of community that's entirely based around commodification. Like from the outset, it's entirely defined by like the things you purchase and own. And when you place people in that situation, it's now very difficult for them to even imagine doing anything else.
Mm-hmm. I guess, I mean, on that note, it's important to just like clarify that we're not talking strictly about the house as a commodity being the bedrock of this new consumer economy, but it's everything around the house. It's the house, but it's also home improvement, as well as all the commodities that your house needs to be filled up with in order to function. And in order for you to be able to like work enough.
Yeah, the whole concept of keeping up with the Joneses really comes into its own around this time. Like,
yeah.
The idea that you need to dress like this, buy this or that, keep up with the latest trends, read the right newspapers, etc., get a TV, expose yourself to advertising in order to be with it, in order to be a good and proper member of society who's embracing that much coveted upward mobility.
Right. So I'll read this quote here. The home became a concentrated node of the creation of new needs for the American working class, a space that needed to be filled with household commodities that usually necessitated car ownership and that could be infinitely improved and renovated. Finally, it represented an investment, a debt to be repaid, and ultimately an asset, and thus consistently produced a more compliant working population. That's pretty important. We're not, in addition to talking about, like, in order for this new consumer market of home ownership to exist, like, you really need credit as well. Like, that is, like, necessarily a part of the equation here. Like, the invention of debt and like how everybody became just like just increasingly saddled with more and more debt is really important here. So you can't really become a homeowner, at least, and certainly not on a social scale, unless credit is expanded to individual consumers, which was only made possible by state intervention into banking. I mean, I guess it's not in the bank's interest to altruistically give individual consumers more credit or something, or maybe they just don't have the power to do that on a wide enough social scale. But the state was motivated and needed to create a new debt economy and give people more credit just so that they could participate and continue driving the economy. So let's go into the next session here. It's called Integration of the White Working Class into Housing and Credit Markets. Which I guess is, it's kind of what we've been talking about already.
Yeah, it sort of recapitulates what we were just saying about how initially after the war there wasn't enough housing available, but very quickly this became a big project to construct these suburbs for the white working class returning from the war, who now began to gradually take on this new identity as the American middle class, and how this gives rise to the illusion of the working class gradually moving up to a higher standard of life. And I do think one part that I found interesting about this particular section that I'm going to read is property ownership allowed some of the working class, aka white vets coming home and getting the GI Bill, to act in a pseudo-capitalist manner. Pseudo. I'll just cut that part out. Pseudo-capitalist manner, managing capital relations in their own lives as owners of futures. So, basically, you had the situation where, as a new homeowner in the suburbs, you're encouraged to buy all of these products. Encouraged to buy a car, encouraged to renovate your home, to buy these appliances like a dishwasher and a washing machine and a TV. And all of these acts of purchasing commodities are framed as a capitalist act. There's the suggestion that by buying these things, by buying a home and renovating it and, getting a backyard pool and buying a second car, all of these large investments were just that, investments. They weren't simply you buying a product, they were you investing in the future. The idea being that it was smart and financially savvy to take part in these rituals. That in doing so, you were taking on the role of the capitalist, that you were engaging with this process of using the money you had available to you to cleverly manipulate the market and create more money for yourself.
To some extent, it's paid out for people who are living during this period. But I think that whenever you see a dominant class talking about people's future and getting the working class to orient their activity around some kind of future, then you can see how it really relies so heavily on it's going to rely so heavily on ideology in order to accomplish that end. You can't really get an entire society to participate in some kind of future oriented activity that is not going to pay off immediately unless you're corrupting their minds with ideology, essentially.
Promising that whatever they're doing now is going to lead to the golden age, that all of your dreams will come true, that this is the objective metaphysical good that you're working towards.
Right, and just commodifying every aspect of existence so that you can't escape, no aspects of existence is free of ideology. I don't even know if I'm sure there was a lot of explicit propaganda produced at this time that was getting people to participate in this kind of suburban 50s nuclear family lifestyle. But at the same time, if you're integrating every aspect of people's material existence into the economy so that they cannot live without participating in these rituals, then like the ideology like creates itself. It like perpetuates itself.
Yeah, it becomes self-reinforcing because on the sort of harsher, more subtextual level, it's like, well, what else are you going to do? You need to keep playing the game.
Yeah.
But this is sort of covered up with like peer pressure, basically. It's like, well, all of your friends are buying this new product, everyone else is doing this, and there can be all these different sort of like normative shaming techniques. Well, you're a man provides for his family, he owns XYZ, or you're this or that, so you're going to have to sort of facilitate that by purchasing these products on the market that allow you to take on a certain identity. And really it reinforces it itself, because even if you ignore the sort of essential aspect of like, oh, you can't actually survive if you don't participate in this game, you're just going to be continuously surrounded by everyone else in your community engaging in this ritual, and if you try to not engage with it, you're going to simply be shut out of any sort of social relation. So it's, you either participate in the market or you've got nothing.
Right, and I think another thing that is really important to like this self-perpetuating ideology and like implanting it into the population at large so that they are like the agents of its own perpetuation is the kind of like stratification within the working class that they're talking about here. So initially, like as we just read, like the GI Bill gives veterans returning from war so many advantages. Like they get their year of unemployment or whatever, they get like capital loans to start businesses, they get college, they get jobs, all this crap, which creates a stratification just among like people who are veterans and people who are not veterans. So there's that stratification, and like in these suburban communities you have all of these people like living side by side. Even like in like wider communities you have this like people of all sorts living side by side here, but then there's this stratification. There's like this kind of a distinction between, you know, veterans who obviously have like a higher quality of life and people who are not veterans. And then like further you have the racialized like lower class who are like, whether or not they're veterans, I mean if they're veterans maybe they're like marginally better than non-veteran racialized people, but then like they're still not going to have access to the same resources as, you know, just your average white guy. And then like, you know, you have the non-veteran racialized people, and you know there's all this stratification within the working class, which I think is really instrumental. Again, like I don't really expect that this was like the intentional design of any like particular capitalist or like even or like group of capitalists, but like all of these things, you know, work together to like reinforce the same hierarchical system where like essentially there's ultimately really just one division that is important between the bourgeoisie and the working class, but then like the bourgeoisie creates all of these divisions within the working class to like confuse the matter and to like, you know, just make it so that, you know, there's less class consciousness, etc.
Yeah, and I do think something you said there is a good point to remember, that with all of these historical unfoldings, it's not like there's a secret cabal of businessmen at the top who are planning this all out carefully and can see 100 years into the future. I think a lot of the detrimental effects of capitalism, in fact, result from this system in which it is of your benefit to be short-sighted and to focus on like personal material gain, and how when we examine these sorts of things, we're merely seeing the macro level phenomenon that result from that process in its historical unfolding.
Right. But also just like the ruling class are the capitalists. They are the people who own the means of production. And even like like a capitalist who is like really rational and, you know, just believes in the system of capitalism, but also wants to do good, like they're going to like do good by this in the terms of capitalism. They're going to, you know, do their best to make capitalism function better, quote scare quotes around that. And like that is ultimately going to benefit them as members of the ruling class. So like, like we don't even really need to necessarily ascribe like malintent to these people. Like they're just doing what's good for them, which is, I mean, they're doing what's good for everybody, which is what's good for them.
Again, like part of the movement, I think, of this thing is that it, at the very least, it creates the sense that all of your other options are being taken away. So I can see from the perspective of the capitalist, it's like, well, I could be a good capitalist and rise up in the system, or I could be a bad capitalist and move down in the system. So I'm going to choose the lesser of two evils because at least my kids will have a good life.
Mm-hmm. So, moving on. There's some important content in this paragraph here that I want to read out just to like illustrate how racism like played a factor here. But explicitly racist regulations around mortgages and lending existed in the FHA's manual until the late 1940s. But even after the removal, both the FHA and the VA actively supported racial covenants on a local basis well into the 1960s, excluding millions of people from the growing market for homeownership. Less than 2% of the homes that were built with help from the $120 billion in housing equity loans from the 40s to the early 60s went to non-whites. Yet that $120 billion represented nearly one-half of all new single-family home purchases between 1947 and 1964. These loans facilitated not only the purchase of more than 12 million mostly suburban housing units, almost exclusively for whites, but also helped secure debt financing for billions of dollars of home repair work. Yeah, just really like concretizing how the entire system is racist and like built around exclusion of non-white people. And really, I mean, it doesn't really seem like there's any logical reason within the terms of capitalism. Like black people are just as much a viable consumer as white people, so it could only really be a holdover of like racist ideology that these kinds of exclusionary measures were perpetuated. I don't really. But I think that's like capitalism generally takes the path of least resistance, which is why like capital and state-oriented capitalism, whatever, is not going to be on its own, like apropos of nothing, like overturning like racist social conventions. Like it's not in its interest to do so, really, and it's not like I don't know, it's not really its prerogative.
Yeah, it's like in the 50s, lots of people were still pretty racist as far as I can tell, so like capitalism's going to take on a racist stance. Right. In 2020, people are, at least there's more talk of maybe being less racist. This seems to be more of a popular viewpoint, so capitalism, of course, presents itself as woke capitalism.
Yeah.
It's always simply just because that's where the dollar is to be made. If tomorrow morning people woke up and were like suddenly really racist again, like really explicitly proud of being racist, capitalism would be like, yeah, fuck yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's really about where, like, I mean, the movement of culture like demonstrates how the working class is actually capable of modifying the terms of capitalism. Like, I mean, I guess my feeling is that it is actually in capital's interest to be an ally to the marginalized, because they are, like, by integrating them into the market more fully and with less like disparity in terms of pay and like job availability or whatever, they're really just serving themselves by bringing more consumers on board. So why doesn't it do that of its own accord earlier in history? Is because like it needs like cultural momentum to push it. Why did it do that? It's because people actually struggled and fought for that. But even as I'm saying that, I realize that like the thesis of Misery and Debt is that there are actually a limited number of jobs. Like scarcity is a real thing. So perhaps, like in the American context, in the context of like white supremacist nation states, it is actually within the logic of capitalism to maintain that racial hierarchy just in order to, preserve its like founding, racial division between, whites and non-whites. You know what I mean? I like this quote about cake mix. Many products that had been substantially innovated and marketed in the 20s but had suffered in sales during the Great Depression were improving their designs and expanding their consumer markets exponentially by the late 40s. In 1940, 60% of the 25 million wired homes in the US had an electric washing machine produced by one of two or three companies. Instant cake mix, first introduced in the 20s, became a phenomenon in the 40s. The freezer and refrigerator, also developed in the 20s and 30s, became standard household staples in the late 40s and 50s, enabling frozen foods, previously a luxury item, to become commonplace. I guess this is really like building off of the previous essay where they talk about how like capital, moves across lines in order to take advantage, or it like technological innovations that are, apparently at first glance, at their first onset, confined to one specific industry, become standardized across lines and like allow for the invention of new commodities, which like allows for the invention of new jobs. But then obviously like what happened to these freezer and refrigerator manufacturers, they first moved overseas and then they became manufactured by robots. So so with like
each either new use value that's created, each innovation that creates a new desire, a new need that didn't exist previously, or with each existing aspect of the human experience, say like baking a cake, which becomes quantified as a commodity, you are increasing the overall feeling of commodification in life. You're sort of, with each aspect that's seized by the market, more and more of your own way of thinking, your own way of being in the world is seen in the form of products that you purchase and formalized rituals which you carry out.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the next section. It's called De-differentiation of the reproductive and productive spheres. So it starts off by making this point that prior to capitalism there really did not exist this kind of distinction between reproductive and productive spheres. Reproductive being like your home, everything that you do that is not working, not selling your labor power, and which allows you to persist until the next day. Like everything that you do on your own time is like what allows you to reproduce yourself as a worker. But back in the day, before capitalism, everything happened at the home. There was no real distinction between this. Like serfs or whatever lived on the plot of land that they farmed for their lord, and it all happened at the home. But then you have the invention of all this shit, like the wage system, which they talk about it here. The home was henceforth the place where the worker rested and consumed a fraction of the product of his labor in the form of wage goods. It was also the place where women's oppression became further ossified. Expected either to stay at home and do the work of reproduction or to submit themselves to worse pay and worse labor standards than those of male workers, pushed out of the common spaces where they had maintained a degree of autonomy and collective power, women's access to the means of production was blocked or restricted through the patriarchy of the wage form. In sum, the home became the exclusive site of the reproduction of labor power, which for the first time appeared as distinctly outside the relations of production, and thus also, for many, outside the purview of Marxism. Like, women were already doing the reproductive labor of, like, Simone de Beauvoir does a great job of, like, going through the history of this, and, like, there are many other feminist scholars who do the same thing, but, like, women have been doing the reproductive labor their whole, like, for all of history. They are principally the people who, like, grow the food that the families eat. They, like, give birth to the children, they raise the children, they take care of the home. They were already doing all of the things that we would classify as reproductive labor, which is like, maintaining the place where the worker is not working. I mean, they're doing labor, but they're not doing like the labor that is exploited either by their lord or by the capitalists. And it becomes ossified under the capitalist regime because. Like, they don't have an equal opportunity to participate in capitalism. Their standards of their work standards are inferior, and their pay is inferior. So, like, their choices are to work horrible jobs for less money than a man, or to become like a housekeeper, basically, like to like maintain their family, to start a family, and then put all the time into reproducing it, which certainly like persists into the 50s. But I think in the 20th century, especially like mid late 20th century, you see like kind of breaking down. And it's not so much that like the labor standards become so equal or whatever, or like the wage becomes so equal, but it's more that like there's just like an increasing necessity for women to enter the labor market, as well as like all these new commodities that kind of like take away or like do the jobs that they traditionally were doing. And also like they don't need to spend so much time producing things from scratch as they did in like feudal times, but they can just go to the market and buy whatever it is they need to reproduce. They need to reproduce themselves. They don't need to spend all day like churning butter. They can just go to the market and buy it.
And again, this is like an example of how capitalism will respond to social movements as they come up, as they become an issue. This is when capitalism starts to care about them. And it will do so in a way that facilitates its own interests. So they mention in this section that even in the 1950s, in the so-called idyllic age of the Leave It to Beaver nuclear family, you had women returning to the workforce because they had previously been in the workforce. This is something that when you read Capital, Karl Marx repeatedly points out, that women, children, everyone was basically working long, hard, difficult days. But in the 1950s, after this brief sort of aesthetic idea of the stay-at-home wife who's just taking care of the home, you already see women returning to the workforce because the debt rate is going up even then, and in order to keep up with the Joneses, in order to keep participating in the ritual of commodity purchase, there needed to be a second income. And how this is in capitalism's interest, because suddenly you have this large surplus population, this sudden influx of many more workers into the workforce, who you can still get away with paying less and treating worse generally, and it encourages these people to buy more stuff, to buy a second car, to buy more automated appliances, to take on all of the roles that women traditionally would have been relegated to taking care of in the home, such as washing clothes and cleaning the house. Now you have vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, things like that. I do like this one quote. This seems vaguely related to all of this. While capitalism initially subordinated the reproduction of labor power through separating reproduction from production, beginning in the post-war period, we find social relations and forms of everyday life increasingly subordinated to the prerogatives of capital's own reproduction through an equally coercive unification of these spheres with the logic of capital.
Mm-hmm.
So, at every turn, it's taking away something that existed previously and replacing it with a simulacra version that can be plugged into the matrix of its own logic.
Wow, scary.
Dun, dun, dun.
I guess this is what they're calling the de-differentiation of reproduction and production, because, like, I guess at some earlier period in history, there is a differentiation made between, these two different spheres of activity, but then as, like, I guess, following from the creation of the housing market and debt and all this sort of thing, you have these two spheres become de-differentiated. Just like as a, I guess, natural consequence of, like, increasing mass consumption and mass production. I think this is a pretty interesting quote that kind of, like, gets at the, like, ideology aspect that we were talking about earlier, and how, like, the working class is responsible for perpetuating the system that works against them. So the quote is, "It became crucial to those with homes to protect their property and to preserve or increase its value by all means possible. Homeowners thus had higher stakes in the perpetuation of the capitalist class relation and often came to believe the bourgeois dictum that value breeds value, and that all commodities can equally be capital. Wage workers, however, by definition, do not accumulate capital but only valorize the capital of others. At the end of the day, the worker returns home with only his wage to pay for a future that is increasingly on loan." I think this paragraph here is also pretty interesting, where they're talking about how like, the working class is just getting more and more in debt, and at the same time, like, just because of the nature of capitalism, living costs are going up, so that which creates this need for women to enter into the workforce. So the quote is, "Although the family wage under Fordism implied that the male breadwinner would be capable of supporting both wife and child, as early as the 1950s, wives began to increasingly supplement the incomes of their husbands with jobs of their own. But while in the 1950s the re-entry of women into the workforce indicated the desire to maintain the pattern of a rising standard or living," I guess that's supposed to be of living, "after the 1960s, the wife's or mother's wage was largely pursued in order to offset the decline in real wages suffered by male workers. Thus was created a reserve army of women workers, temporarily and precariously plugged into capital, supplying it with flexible and expendable labor, maintained in this position by patriarchal structures in both corporate practice and the labor movement." I feel like this is really building off of some of what was, like, outlined in the previous essay, Misery and Debt, about how just, like, inevitably over time, by the very nature of the capitalist system, wages are always going down and the cost of living is always going up, and, like, the two kind of, like, exist in opposition to each other. So it's really just inevitable that this sort of thing happens, and then you need this surplus population of women workers there ready to like, allow the working class to continually reproduce itself by earning money in these, like, precarious and less good jobs.
Yeah, which I do think they touch on something that's really has, like, a felt resonance here. The experience of living in the so-called North American middle class is one of being in this situation where there's a certain narrative about the good life, about how you just need to do X, Y, Z and things will play out well for you. And the example they use here is the idea that there's this family wage where the father can go to work a 9-to-5 job 5 days a week, and he'll be able to support a family of several people and pay off his mortgage. And yet, actually living this out, it seems like something's not quite working. You're being told this narrative about just do X, Y, Z and things will go well for you. You'll move up in society. And yet, the average person tries to do this again and again, and they find that it just doesn't work. So they need to do these lateral movements, which in the 1950s would have been, not just the husband goes to work, but the wife also has to go to work, even though officially what the narrative they're being told is that there just needs to be this one breadwinner. And I think this process has been the defining characteristic of the American middle class throughout its existence from 1950s up until its gradual dissolving in the present day, is there's always this idea that there's a certain game that you can play, and if you play it, everything will go well for you and you'll be able to live like those nice families you see on TV. And yet the actual experience of doing it is you see that it's not working. You see that your debt's going up, that you seem to be getting increasingly stressed out, that you need to do all these other cost-saving measures. More of the family needs to go to work. They say on the next page that children went from being productive members of the family to liabilities, where even the very idea of having a kid becomes this difficult point of contention that you need to carefully consider.
Mm-hmm.
There's a broader point about the essay, is we see that in the 50s there was this, at least there was this sort of normative narrative that people could participate in, and now we see the result of that is that it's completely collapsed, and there is no narrative. The narrative for a millennial is shit, I don't know, become an Uber driver?
Yeah.
I hope you like pornography and video games.
Yeah. I feel suffering.
Yeah, it's it's a more degraded version. It's
I guess the narrative for millennials is that they're a bunch of whiny babies.
Yeah, it's this worked for us in the 1950s, it'll work for you now, because the conditions of the 1950s were this eternal...
Just go to college for free, buy a house for $50,000 and, immediately get a job that pays, that allows you to pay off your mortgage in 10 years and then retire at the age of 50. What's the problem, millennial? Fucking snowflake.
I hope that sort of mindset dies off with the boomers. I would like to think that everyone who's been born or has come of age since the mid 1980s at least is a little more aware that the so-called narrative of the good life is just that. It's not any sort of objective reality that's eternally available for whoever wants to play the game.
And I feel so many of those narratives are really overstated and probably not that widely held amongst the population. They're just, popularized through media.
Yeah, it's that lingering tension. It's you're kind of aware that it's not really working, but it's what else are you going to do? Put on a smile, go to work, hope that it gets better.
Alright, so you've arrived at a point where, workers are all in debt to all of these new goods that they needed in order to reproduce themselves, in order to go to the labor market, in order to get more money. And, it's everybody is now participating in this vicious cycle, not just men, but, women are suffering more, and also non-white people are just more harshly exploited by this exploitative system. So where does this essay end off?
So basically it's talking about the rising debt, which has been something that's been happening since the onset of the New Deal. And they say this pattern could only be sustainable as long as wages increase in proportion to productivity. Until the 1970s, debt financing for the household thus never went too far beyond remuneration. And average housing values tended to hover around average wages, with needs rising not too far ahead of the ability to fulfill them. people were borrowing somewhat beyond their immediate means, but their rising wages generally compensated for this expansion of debt. So long as capitalist expansion continued to thrive, the projected future of the reproduction of the working class seemed inevitable. After 1975, household debt, already significant, began to spin out of control. And then it goes on to describe the process that I'm sure we're all at least familiar with on a felt level.
Yeah.
Of debt spiraling out of control, wages stagnating, job opportunities diminishing.
Cost of living going up,
Yeah.
housing, like commodities costs going up, housing going up.
And this sort of, like, always fictitious, always contingent idea of the American middle class, the American dream, which flourished for a few brief decades, is now revealed to be nothing more than a dream.
We're at the end of the essay, and basically we've just got to the point where, like, this very, very precarious balance, that this whole dream that you're talking about, let's not forget that it rested fundamentally on the disproportionate and exploitation of women and racialized people. Like, that was really fundamental to this integration of the white working class into the housing and credit markets, to quote one of the section titles. But this whole dream, this whole very, very precarious, like, delicate balance between the price of commodities and the price of life versus wages has, like, broken down, and like it's no longer manageable for anybody to live the kind of standard of life that, you know, we have all been promised in various forms.
Yeah, and it's like a two-pronged attack on this idea where, on the one hand, it demonstrates how much of it was based on oppression and exploitation. And even if you had someone that said, like, well, I'm all right with that, I'm a white guy, I just want to have that nice Norman Rockwell life, the other prong of the attack is it demonstrates that it wasn't even real.
Yeah.
It was advertising and lies, and it wasn't sustainable. And even, like, the white father breadwinner figure, ultimately that's an illusion. That wasn't an actual person that existed. It was based on a false reality.
Yeah, I don't mean to say this as a criticism, although it may be, but the racial and, like, gendered dynamics that are a part of this analysis are a bit, I don't want to say like not considered or something, but they're not like Endnotes' whole project that we have seen so far is to, like, really nail down the internal dynamics of the system, like, in their abstract, and, like, talk about how, you know, the capitalist system is full of these contradictions, as Marx identified, and, like, certainly in history those things are intricately bound up with, like, the oppression of these various communities. But, like, even if that oppression did not exist, then, you know, the system would still be breaking down before us, and, like, you know, resulting in, like, the oppression of the working class, even if there were no divisions amongst the working class. So, like, like, they did their due diligence and noted these, like, intersectional aspects of capitalist exploitation, but their ambition with this particular piece was not to go into great length with these various questions. So they're just, like, outlining it. And I'm dead certain that they go into these sorts of issues at greater length in either other essays or other volumes of Endnotes. Like, I'm pretty sure Endnotes 4 is, like, entirely devoted almost to like, racial questions, and, like, it becomes, like, a major theme throughout the series. So they're not, like, accidentally, like, not writing about these questions or anything. Like, All right, we're at 1 hour and 15 minutes.
We did it.
Okay, I gotta. And we're